welcome. Welcome back to our regular public forums, not about elections, imagine that. And we're going to talk about a subject today that's very close to my heart, and it's something that is of constant interest to us in Armenia. I will introduce our guests in a minute, but before that, let me just set this in the following way. That you know that when we do these public forums, we try to caution our guests to talk about the subject at hand and not to start with Noah and the Ark and prehistoric times. But I'm going to start with Noah and the Ark and prehistoric times. For the following reason, I think that we are talking about ourselves, our history, our issues. We ask a lot of questions. You know, we don't know whether this nation that for 3,000 years has served is a victor, especially Harp, the only one on earth, God's gift to mankind, right up there next to Jesus Christ, or whether because we've been victims of empire for 3,000 years, therefore we're dumb, we're servile, we're docile, we don't know how to strategize, think, plan. We have this confused self-image. And one would have thought that with independence, that maybe some of it would have fallen into place and we would have seen ourselves as a normal nation in a world that changes. But largely because, I think, largely because of the unresolved conflict to the east and the continued closed borders and denial to the west. Unfortunately, we have, it seems to me, not transcended and not found a place where we can ask questions about who we are, what we want our children to learn, what we want our teachers to teach, how we see ourselves, how we saw ourselves in the past, in the present, and in the future. That's a whole lot of questions, and I would like at the end of today's discussion to really have better questions. Questions that we would like our policymakers, our curriculum developers, our teachers, our graduate students to be asking. Don't want answers. I just like a whole lot of good questions. And to help us get there, we have three guests, very special, very different backgrounds. Vahram Dermatevosyan is a professor of history, a historian in Armenian-Turkish relations specifically. He teaches at the American University of Armenia. Karina Korostelina, not bad, I'm going to get worse when I get to Phil, is a professor at George Mason University, and she's done a great deal of research in terms of history, identity, especially in conflict regions. And Phil Gamaghelian, not bad, huh? Why? It's interesting problem بدون نام. Phil Gamaghelian is a PhD student in history, again at George Mason University, who's done a great deal of work on the ground with Azeri students, Georgian students, Armenian students, and is in the middle of this issue of history and identity. So welcome, and thank you for being here. Thank you for being here for what is maybe not a sexy topic, but I think is a fascinating. I would like to start, Karina, with you, and start in the following place. You know, we think we're special, and we think we're the only one in the world with these kinds of problems. And I was shocked when I found out that the governments of Austria and the Czech Republic spend $15 million a year to help their peoples get over the stereotypical memories of history and move on. Are we alone? I mean, are we alone in this current conflict situation where we're intransigent in our definitions of the other's identity? How are other countries doing this? How do we get past this?
First of all, of course, you are. You're a unique and wonderful country. First of all, what I really want to tell that why it's extremely important, why we turn into history education when we speak about conflicts and conflict resolution. The issue that history does not only provide for us meaning of our past, but it's also create understanding of our current events. And the most important, it's provide for us roadmap for the future. Because history, I'm speaking about historic narrative. I'm not speaking about history as something which object. I'm speaking about historic narrative.
The way we tell it.
Yes, the way we tell, the way we teach, we propose and choose particular events and interpret particular events. This historic narrative really creates ideas of and beliefs, the most important, deep beliefs of who we are, who are others, who are our enemies, for what reasons, and what they done to us, and why we are of their deeds. And this is extremely important, especially if, as you told, when we speak about identity issues, because despite different ideas that identity can be recreated, can be defined and so on, there are some elements of identity which is really hard to change. And these elements especially connected with the threat narratives. Idea of threat is extremely important.
Current threat.
It can be current, but it can be something which we call chosen traumas coming from the past. But the most important, and I can tell you why, because actually we live in the world where we choose identities. Like suits in the, because each of us have identities. We can have our national, ethnic, gender identity, regional identity. We have a real set of identities which can serve us. But the most important that we, in this situation, we choose them suits. If we like the suit helps us, we use this identity for a long time. If it doesn't work for us, we can change other identity. And because we have multiple identities, we usually have our own views of the world. It's helping us to understand our own views. But the issue is that then we are not protected by the society. We need some group which will give us protection, which will help us in situation of threat. And while we accepting such group, one will become loyal to such group. What we are doing, we are giving up our values, our own ideas. The more we're loyal to the group, the more we're accepting ideas, beliefs, perceptions of the group. And the most important, answering your questions, history of the group. We accept this historic narrative which is dominant in society. And each person can choose in this balance. Do you want freedom in the world or you want more security? And identity resolves this balance between freedom and security. But the issue is that if there is a threat narrative in society, threat narrative connected with history, then people more and more giving up their own beliefs, their own value system, and they try to follow particular history. And this issue is extremely important. More and more become understanding for many different programs in history, as you told. That's why, as you, for example, your example of Czech and narrative, where Austrian narrative, where they really understand that if people follow already established narrative, they never can overcome negative relationship between people. That even context theory, there is a context theory, the more you know, more people know from other sides, the better relationships. Context theory will not work because there is this acceptance of dominant narrative. We called it in our field, we called it myth. Some mythic narrative, which is metative, which persists in society. So what is important? Yes.
Is it possible that the dominant narrative, the way my history is told not by me, but by the other guys? And I want to ask Vahram to take your, freedom, security, and the identity in the middle and translate it to us, perhaps. It seems to me our current narrative is really defined not by us, because we allow them. It's defined by Turkey or Azerbaijan, in our case. And we react to that, I think. No, Vahram?
Well, I wouldn't agree with that, Salpi, because it depends what's your perspective of approaching that. If you're, as it was the case for a couple of years ago, as if Armenian youth and Armenian society was following the Turkish and Azerbaijani news on a daily basis, and they were making citations on the public television from these news agencies, then you could feel the problem hanging in the air. But on the other hand, fortunately, that policy changed, and there was no direct citation starting from 2008 from Azerbaijani and Turkish sources. Or there were, you could in 2007-8 you could see some press releases basically of Turkish news agencies or Azeri news agencies. But the situation is now actually changing. To what direction it remains to be seen, but you can certainly see that somehow as it's the case in Turkey, basically every Armenian who is sort of active in blogosphere or in the news, they can at least name two Turkish publications, Today's Zaman and Hürriyet Daily News, which are basically sort of became those avenues that transcend the images, the interpretations of local regional
stereotypes,
issues and stereotypes from Turkey, and Today's Zaman connected with Justice and Development Party, transferring these images and news to, let's say, to the Armenians. So these two publications have become those important avenues that we have an understanding of Turkey. So we see only the one direction of this policy, but we need to go beyond that and see that perhaps it's also part of some kind of policy that they sort of erect and shape the understanding of those events that they want us to understand.
Well, I'd agree with you if all of us read English, but because we don't, our understanding of the Turkish narrative about us is still not that enlightened, because we still have the old memories and we don't have access to, and we don't try to, together with them, in some way replace those. Phil, what is our narrative, the way you hear it from our young people as you see them in outside environments?
Actually, if I can a little bit pick up from the previous question too, I would say there are some stories that are created currently through media and so on, but I think the main narratives, meta-narratives, as Karina was mentioning, are there. But I think it's necessarily Turkey and Azerbaijan either. I think we inherited very much the Soviet narrative, the Soviet way of teaching history, and the current narrative has been predefined and has been constructed during the Soviet Union time. So we kind of maybe make some changes to it, but overall the framework stays the same. And your question to me?
Well, forget that. Let me ask this one. When you say we've taken on the Soviet framework, that means what? That means there's no...
That means, so Soviet time, I think history has been extremely ideological. It has been used for ideological ends, and there was a very particular narrative created to support the regime or the system that was working then. So, and the way the history was taught at the time was, first it was one story top-down, decided on the top, then spread through the school system, and then the way it was taught also important because people were made to memorize that's what's written and pretty much repeat back without any ability to question what's in there. So in post-Soviet time, we of course wrote the last 20 years of history because it came later than the Soviet time, and maybe wrote a little bit about the Soviet times more critically than it was before, but going back further than that, essentially the narrative is the same, very similar to the one that was in the Soviet time, and it's taught the same way that it was taught in the Soviet time, which is you have to memorize without necessarily questioning.
Is the problem that it's top-down? Because I suspect it's top-down everywhere. It's certainly top-down in the United States, where these curricula are developed and the textbooks are written so they can be sold. So there's some central element, but then the not questioning isn't there. No, Karina, is it that way everywhere?
First of all, in the United States, it's definitely not top-down, because every single state has its own right to produce its own textbook and choose its own textbooks. It's the same as in Germany, every land has their own rights to choose textbooks.
That's pretty top-down.
But what I can tell you, honestly, yes, of course, if we take even Europe, which is pretty democratic society, only 3 countries, Sweden, Norway and Finland, does not have state control over textbooks. All others have state control, but state control doesn't mean bad all the time. For example, in Germany there is control not to produce any nationalistic narratives. But speaking about the production of historic narrative, I just finished research in Ukraine, and I was doing interviews with history teachers in different regions of Ukraine. And I was shocked how strongly conflict narrative is produced and reproduced on the level of history teachers.
Even now, when the conflict is not...
It's still in conflict, still there is a very strong conflict between pro-Russian, pro-communist group and pro-nationalistic Ukrainian group. Country still, like every May 9th, there are some people who got in hospital because of fight for red or against red flag. It's still there. But the issue is that history teachers, even they have the same textbook, they sometimes bring textbook into the class to show what's wrong is in textbooks. And to bring to the class to show, don't read this because it's wrong. Each of them has very strong ideas. Who is right, who is wrong, who country should belong to, who have a right to define where country is going to. And each history teacher produced this conflict in their classroom. Even I was there, even I was watching some class interaction and speaking to children, I still saw how history teachers produce this conflict in society. So this is really important to understand that production of meta-narrative is not going only from the government or from the people who are writing history textbooks. It's also produced in the level of society through history education, but be honest, it's also produced in the kitchens. The parents really tell particular story to children, and because parents are emotionally involved, they're not telling multiplicity of truths. They're not telling different approaches. They tell on one particular truth, which is actually always emotionally driven. And this really produces some beliefs. Again, I really want to stress, historic narrative is a belief in intergroup relations. And this belief, which is something we're taking with us through all our life.
This audience is probably tired of my saying this, but isn't at the bottom of this not the fact that everybody has their narrative, but that we're not tolerant about any other narrative? It's not that there is whatever version being taught in the kitchen or in the classroom, but at the end of the day, we're not willing to step back and say, I wonder what they think about this. Phil, isn't that where the problem is? That we're not willing to question it, not that we have it.
Not necessarily. They are probably at this point. And I think not only us. I think it's in the beginning of the 20th century, we got to point when pretty much that seemed to be the framework for history everywhere in the world. The history has been seen as just one, pretty much national history, and a lot of things have been seen in that framework, which we also accepted. But history doesn't have to be only a political history, which it is now. And we are so used to this framework that we see it as the normal one, as the accepted one, and kind of don't even question that. So actually discussed today that even in agreement with you, though, because when you are used to this framework, even when you look into information, to go to internet or go to free sources when actually information is available, you do look information that confirms your beliefs rather than looking for alternatives. So yeah, we do function in that framework, and which I think is a big problem, the way we are used to thinking about history specifically.
And can I just add, because this is very important, that when we speak about history education, it's not only about identity. There is third very important variable here, power. Because history education, history narratives, not only produce identity, which is defined who we are and who are others. It's also reproduce and produce power relationships. Who has right to dominance? Who is a victim? Who has to be punished? And this is really important. That's why historic narratives become zero-sum game. Because if our historic narrative wins, we have a power. If we lose power. So this unification, this cementations of power within the structure of historic narrative is extremely important in understanding your question.
Vaham, do we ask these questions, whether it's in the university as the potential textbook writers are being prepared, whether it's at the teaching university, whether it's the curriculum writers, in the Ministry of Education? Are we asking these questions about our own version of history?
Well, definitely we do, but I want to go, your question has two layers. I want to touch upon the question of for writing history textbooks. It is tremendously difficult and challenging question. First of all, I remember that for a certain period of time after the independence, some managers of our higher education institutions were involved in the question why we don't have a unified history textbook. I mean, that was a question that was puzzling for me, because why the higher education system needs a unified textbook. That was not quite understandable for me. But recently I heard that that some historians came up with the history textbook, believe it or not.
A unified textbook.
Yes, and it has a couple of volumes, and it's going to be sort of a compulsory for at least historians in the Yerevan State University or other universities for that matter. So that's. But coming to the high school textbooks that I think we know better than the others, it's really a challenging, a daunting task for people who are involved, because you always have in Armenian, especially in when the historians are dealing with the origins of Armenian nation, going to times immemorial, and the history which is more sensitive, the history of 19th century and 20th century. So you always have this debate, and it depends who is in charge of that particular ministry, that they are writing down the history of that particular period. And for most of the time, I think it's too sensitive to be left to non-professionals to write these history books. First of all, history books are important, provide important toolbox for creating identities, and also for creating role models, so that the students can either follow or avoid, reject. But I want to touch upon the Turkish cases, if you allow me. Turkish cases are tremendously interesting, and I have been studying the Turkish textbooks for a couple of years now. Turkish education system is tremendously interesting, and I'll start by saying that if we want a breakthrough in the Turkish-Armenian discourse, it should start from educational system in Turkey. And it is more than clear, and all the intellectuals in Turkey, starting from the people that our audience is better aware of, like Taner Akçam and Fatma Mira Göçek, they are all in favor of that. If you want to understand Turkish national discourse, if you want really Turkey to recognize the Armenian genocide, it all starts from education system, because the education system of Turkey is too nationalistic, and the nationalistic tone is basically compulsory tone, and in a way that you are not even thinking of questioning what is written, and it is militaristic, very militaristic. And Turkish education historiography basically is based on the 1927 famous speech by Mustafa Kemal, which lasted 6 days, and where he basically became the cornerstone of Turkish historiography. And the Turkish students in the schools, they have to recite many quotations from Atatürk. And one interesting example also, just to understress the case that in Turkey the education has an understressed importance, that there are only 2 ministries in Turkey which have the title of national, and the Ministry of National Education and Ministry of National Defense. This is just to indicate what level of importance is ascribed to the education system. And one more thing, 1920s, Atatürk, when he launched his education reform, he also became to be known as teacher-in-chief, başöğretmen, meaning that in the public eye he was perceived as a person who is leading, and who is only one who was entitled to provide official history.
Okay, now I'm going to say something not happy, and then ask Karina the $60,000 question. My comment that's not happy is, at least he tried. At least there was an effort to define a self-image. Now, maybe he didn't ask anybody the questions, had the answers himself alone. But at least the question was asked as to who it is we, the Turkish people, think we are. Karina, we just appointed you Minister of Education. You have all the resources you like. what are the questions you think our educational policymakers ought to be asking so that we in this region can get to a place where we can live in peace? That's not a hard question, is it?
If we have time, like 5 hours, do you have 5 hours, guys?
Absolutely, they're not going anywhere.
Okay. Coffee, tea, and we can start. Okay. That of course, this question is already explored in many research. For example, in my recent book, which just was published, Forming Culture of Peace, we explore exactly how to redefine different discourses, especially discourses of injustice, discourses of violence. And some topics we already, first of all, what I really want to tell, it should be systemic approach. We really could not resolve any issue by just telling this is the best way. There are multiplicities of ways which are extremely interconnected. For example, issue of trauma, acknowledgement of trauma, is extremely important issue which gives opportunity for a nation to increase self-esteem, to increase willingness to be in dialogue. Because if trauma acknowledged, reconciliation is achieved, nation is healed. It's really helping nation to be part of reconciliation dialogue. But you could never achieve this idea of acknowledgement of trauma if you also will not respect idea that truth can have multiple versions. You could not search for only truth. It's also the huge problem. So it should be really that multiplicity of ideas, multiplicity of approaches, acknowledgement that it could be different voices. It's an important issue. What I would, and another, again, the same component of this, they're all interconnected. I really want to stress interconnections between them. Issue of revenge and justice. Because if we will continue to search for revenge, the spiral of violence will continue in the society. Society will never heal if it will look for such ideas that something should be done to them because they are perpetrators and victims. Just to give you probably the most extreme example, think about child soldiers in Uganda. Children which were abducted when they were at the age of 5, 6. They were forced to do all things. I don't want even to repeat what crimes beyond imagination they were forced to do. Now when they rescued, they returned back to their villages. They are 15, 16. They even, based on international law, they could not go in court because they are not 18 years old yet. But they committed awful crimes. What to do with these people? Are we ready to reconcile and forgive them? Or we still need justice and bring them to justice? And this is society, every single society, again, I'm giving the extreme example, but every single society are going through issues. That's why what I would recommend, again, I gave you 3 major issues which are interrelated, should be answered, not easy answers. Relation, multiplicity, acknowledgement of trauma, multiplicity of truth, but what is also probably, what should be done, multiple stakeholders should be brought together. And by multiple stakeholders, I mean people who approach differently the same issues. I would say people who really try to think that power is not connected with being ready for aggression of others. Being tolerant give you more power, give you more stronger approach to situation than being ready for a fight with others. And this is very important to understand. Only multiple stakeholders in society can create coherent narrative which will bring society to peace.
If I may jump in, just 2 small comments. I think in general people tend to overestimate the importance of history textbooks or as reconciliatory tools. And I think history textbooks can do their job as tools for reconciliation if 2 conditions are met. First is if there is a proper political environment. The second, if there is more or less stable peace. Let's take the example of Azerbaijan and Armenian. There have been multiple efforts to write a common narrative. And there are different evaluations of the job that has been done, but they work because the environment is not ready to consume what has been produced. So if proper political environment is created, if hate speech, if dehumanization of the other, if attachment and emotional incorporation of hate speech and emotional speech are there, I cannot imagine that history textbook can be powerful tools in order to change the mindset. And also, let's take the example of what happened when France and Germany started to write sort of common history books. When in the beginning of 50s, I mean, when the war was over, Germany was totally defeated. I think that Germany and Poland started to write these common history books in the beginning of 70s. I mean, almost 30 years of the war. So the environment is necessary.
Yeah, which is often the same thing that we say for reconciliation, right? That one side has to win, one side has to be over, so that we can move on.
Still, if we get examples, for example, Prime Project in Middle East, where now in the midst of conflict, Israel and Palestinian people from grassroots initiative started with two histories, one from Israel, one from Palestine, and they created free textbooks which produce not common narrative, of course, not like in German French situation, but they produce common textbooks which provide two narratives and give opportunity to compare and understand, or take, for example, conflict which is still very far from reconciliation. It's the issue of comfort women and issue of Nanjing between China, Korea and Japan. And still there are three major projects produced, free textbooks produced as a complementary textbooks, which is used now pretty successfully in history, in education in all three countries. And Bosnia, just after the middle of war, Rwanda, South Africa, there are a lot of examples where reconciliation was achieved partly because children start thinking in different way. Children grow up and they create policy.
Phil, your last words, and then we're opening it up.
Sure.
The $64,000 question.
Well, I think it's a chicken and egg dilemma, actually, which one brings which, because yes, political environment is a problem and conflict is the problem, but then also education is, I believe, the problem, at least is one of the producers of the problem. And I don't want to single out history education. I would say also early education is a big part of the problem. Also literature education is a big part of the problem. Geography, pretty much all the humanities are part of the problem.
Mathematics.
Mathematics sometimes, but I don't want to go there. But so again, I think the education produces what then we consume. Again, conflicts are recreated through and sustained through the education system as well. And Karina mentioned many examples of work being done already in the conflict environment. For example, in Cyprus, which is still in a very much state of the conflict that hopefully might move the relationship forward.
Just to give you a very funny example about mathematics, really, in Crimea, in Ukraine, was a real scandal. Then they started analyze math textbooks and found one task for children, second grade. Somebody had some ships, and Tatars stole some ships.
Naturally.
How you could create conflict?
Your turn to ask the $64,000 question. What are the questions we want our policymakers to be asking so that we can grow citizens that will live in a region of peace? Hamitzik.
Yes, I have three maybe short questions. Yes, one is, does it mean that $15 million that Czechs will spend for overcoming their stereotypes, does it mean that 20 years later they will spend more 15 millions to overcome new stereotypes that would come? The second question is, how is it easy to be historian if at least 50% of dates are false and are created and invented, but they are not true? 50% of dates, historical dates, are invented and they are not true, are written by the winners. And the third question is it good to know more core self-identity. If you know more about your history, you will find out that there were no winners, glorious victories. There were also shameful defeats, and not all actions of your heroes were wise, and some were stupid, and etc. Thank you.
3 questions, 3 speakers. Take 1 each.
You're historian, take historian.
Okay. I guess, well, being, well, it depends what kind of historian you're talking about. Every profession is difficult. If you want to become a leader or knowledge specialist in your field, of course it is difficult. But it's particularly difficult for Armenian context to become a good historian, a knowledge historian, because you need to meet certain criteria. First is, I don't know where you took this figure 50% because it blew my mind, and it's just something that is really interesting. Of course,
Also invented.
it's also invented, right? I mean, I see where you're going. I see that currently, in Armenia, we are in the process of consolidating what it means history, and there is an internal discussion how to proceed and where to proceed in terms of writing a history that is not national-centric, that will be acknowledged and recognized and written and read by other historians, professionals from different universities. I mean, because I have heard also diaspora scholars, very acknowledged scholars, who take our history books, or in general, some scholarly research, and they are just asking, what is written? Have you reread this second time? I mean, there are so many errors. But let's take this aside because it's a scholarly debate, and they will be eliminated with the passage of time. But being a historian for me is a person who knows all the relevant sources which are connected to the problem that you are studying. Being an historian for me is that you are not biased. You cannot interpret the facts the way you prefer. That you are not attached to the power corridors, and you are not somehow affiliated with any movements that have different interpretations of that particular event.
I'll take, yes, I will take the third question. Of course, some nations could not accept, and I will take example of China, where because they presented this moral dichotomy between moral Chinese people, very humanitarian type of civilization, and Western civilization, which is imperialistic and aggressive. They had to explain somehow their invasions. So during nationalistic time, they explained that, first of all, during the communist time, they explained that it was not actually invasions, it was class struggle. So it was poor people fighting with their discriminators, and Chinese people were coming and liberating them. During nationalistic time, their communist idea was not important anymore. They invented other concepts that actually these people were Chinese. They just didn't know that they're Chinese. So Chinese people were coming and giving them ideas of culture. Of course, you could not, there is one way how to not accept. But there are a lot of good examples how to accept wrongdoings. And Germany probably is the best way. And how it's possible? Because you really have to create difference between you people as German, as ethnic group as Germans, and political and social processes which were in this time in this country. Germans and cultural identities, ethnic identity are not responsible for Nazis. It was particular social and political processes which were during this time in society which lead to particular crimes. That's why still in Japan there are problems of accepting Japanese issue, because pride is the core of Japanese identity, and it's really hard for them to distinguish Japaneseness as identity and crimes committed by nationalistic party. So what is important really to have opportunity to realize that what was done by the country is not connected with your pride as identity and something. In Australia, they were finally able to overcome the idea that they are not invented Australia, they did not discover it Australia, but there were some people living Australia before British coming to Australia, and as soon as they were able to accept it, they created new Australian history, because before 1986 they taught Great Britain history. There were no Australian history at all. Imagine, Australia 1986. First time they had this textbooks, Australian textbook. So it's possible to overcome such, but you really have to have deep understanding of social processes in society.
Phil, Czech Austria.
I'll go to the first question then about why I don't think that money will be wasted in Austria and Czech Republic. Up until after the First World War, there was a very specific pattern of writing history, which I think we all still have, which is pretty much all the events that are showing us our side in a positive light are written, and everything that's showing us the negative lights pretty much is removed and gradually forgotten, and everything that shows the other, especially if it's an enemy, in the negative side is included. Anything like neutral or positive about them is excluded. So this is a very consistent pattern through pretty much all the history textbooks up until 50s, 60s, anywhere. So that has changed in Europe, which is why Europe is a really instructive case for us, I think. For Germany, okay, it was defeated side, it accepted its own responsibility, that we can understand, maybe. But how about French changing their history? They could have as well went on and said, you know, we are the suffering side here, we are the victims, we can go on writing all this bad stuff about Germany and Germans. So they actually changed as well. And so basically there was a conscious attempt not to portray Germans as only these people who committed the crimes during World War II, but also put some positive and neutral information about them, write common history, put some critical information about themselves, which was a very, very conscious attempt. And then through German, Polish, German, Czech, pretty much similar processes went forward, and I believe we don't have right now conflicts in Europe that we had 50 years ago. It's quite obvious. So I don't think that money will be wasted in that sense.
My name is Yelena Osipova, and I'm at the School of International Service at Washington, D.C. So I do international affairs and public diplomacy. I'm a PhD student, so my work directly sort of associates with historical issues. You know. So having lived in Armenia, in the diaspora, and most importantly in between, I have come to sort of see and live this multiplicity and sort of experience it firsthand. But I think, as you already mentioned, and as we all here know, what is missing in the society
I want to add to that through my own fault, this discussion about history turned into a study of our bilateral relations with our neighbors, rather than a history of our internal social and political development, democratic or not democratic, over the centuries. And so, in a very direct way, your question is that question. It gives you, very briefly, a chance to talk about how we don't even really talk about our own internal political, social choices, preferences, directions, tolerance internationally, tolerance domestically.
I want to say that currently it is very difficult to write history textbooks without taking into consideration certain resolutions that have been passed by EU or European Council and other institutions. So I mean, it is rather difficult, but despite of that fact, there are many. For instance, Azerbaijani textbooks. They are well aware the internal legislation in Azerbaijan is very strict. They don't prohibit hate speech, nationalistic speech, but it doesn't matter. I mean, they have certain laws and they have to execute. Coming to them, so if we want to understand like how the Azerbaijani national discourse is on their history, it's quite simple. One of the great philosophers of the 20th century said one of the first and greatest tasks of any statesman is to create myth. And I guess Aliyev did a wonderful job in that terms. So they created sort of a longitude of myth which are visible and everywhere, and which became an official narrative. So how to, of course, state dictates how the teaching of history should be carried out. We're talking about schools, let's make clear, but civil society has a huge say in this whole discourse. Again, I'm coming to Turkey. All the amendments that have been done in the history textbooks, basically, I would say 80% of them were under the heavy pressure, either from civil society organizations or from EU. I mean, just the very recent example concerning Syriacs living in Turkey. There was an immense pressure on the Ministry of Education to change the rhetoric in the textbooks in order not to make anti-Syriac demonstrations in the southeastern part of Turkey. So, so this is a sort of triangle society, which is sort of mostly consumer. I don't really ascribe big power to society in changing the history textbooks, but civil society and government.
We have our own internal myths.
Yeah.
We've done pretty well internally. No?
Yeah, I think we've done pretty well internally. But going directly to your question and incorporating that as well, I think the role, yes, civil society has a role and governments has a role, but I believe if we are considering ourselves scholars in this, I think intellectuals also have a role. And I don't think we are unique in the sense of where we stand with our understanding of history and very much mythologization of it. Again, I believe it was across the board pretty much in the whole world up until 50s, and that was pretty much the state of social science, that history was seen as just one story, each nation producing its own essentially and then selling it as science. That has started changing at 50s, 60s, quite late if you think of the 20th century, when philosophers, some of the philosophers, some critical anthropologists and so on, raised the question that actually the event as it happens is actually a different thing from the narration of the event, that it makes it into a textbook or is just reported in media and so on. So if we acknowledge this distinction, essentially what we have is a narrative written by someone of an event. And that's really started changing the approach to history, but very slowly, because the education system was very much founded on this previous understanding of history as one. So that's change hasn't yet made into the education, I can say, and into the academia necessarily in Armenia and in the post-Soviet space at all.
And it's leaving huge consequences, because it means that we take events like yesterday and explain them in terms of nationalism and Christianity and whatever label we think, you know, fits from our history. And somehow that's okay. It's somehow some historic continuation of what we've been, when we really haven't asked the questions about how we've defined our social structures and everything else.
Yeah, and what it's important if we speak about tolerance. What really important understand what tolerance, what does it mean when we use this word, and it means that we are able to accept. We don't have to really put it as something important, but we can accept, acknowledge that there are other ways of life, there are other perspectives, and it can be achieved only through one way, through comparative analysis. The only way to be tolerant is to be comparative. If you, as you told, you live in DC and come here for summer to visit your family, you see that there are different value systems, there are different perspectives, there are different ways how people see particular events. This is what makes you tolerant. If you live in society which proposes only one way of interpretation, only one dominant meta-narratives, it's harder to accept that there are multiple truths, multiple ideas. Just to give you a very good example, in Virginia there is a museum of civic war. And in this museum, you go there, and in Richmond, and you see narrative of South is still there. You still see monuments for Confederates, and there is narrative of the North. And every time you see some particular event, some particular photo, you see how it's interpreted by people from still support southern sentiments and people who support northern sentiments. And then give you perspective. It's make you tolerant. Why they feel this way? Why they feel that way? What happens in society? Why people still could not reconcile some particular issues? And what I want to finish on, that what is important, that recent research in sociology shows that ambivalence is one of the most important factors of developed society. If society democratic, it supports different ways of understanding. Societies which are not well developed, they hold one meta-narrative which is shaped by the threat.
I think if we take no other line away from this discussion, it should be that. You made a really fast jump. You said, look, you come from Washington, you see that there are different value structures there, value structures here, and then your conclusion was, and that makes you more tolerant. I can very easily say the same thing, and my conclusion will be, you're wrong and they're right. I mean, you went a whole different way with that conclusion. So we have a ways to go.
Խոհանոցային պատմության դասավանդման մի օրինակ էր, երբ ես իմ 4 տարեկան եղբորորդին հարցրեցի ինչի է պետք դանակը, ու ինքը շատ կողմնորոշված ասաց թուրքերին եմ սպանելու։ Ու հետո ես եղբորս հետ բռնկվեցի բանավեճի, որտեղ ինքն ասում էր, որ հա պիտի այսպես մեծանան, որպեսզի վաղը դու ունենաս մարդունակ բանակ, որպեսզի մարդը դաշտ գնա, չգիտեմ նվիրում ունենան, այստեղ ես մի քիչ զինվորի այլ պատկերացում ունեի, բայց ես ամեն դեպքում փորձեցի նաև իրեն հասկանալ, հիմա որքանով եմ ես ճիշտ կամ սխալ մտածում այս ամենի մասին։
I already put idea of power here, and what I want really to tell that there are some people mistaking tolerance for absence of power, and this is not right. The stronger you are, the stronger you are, the more you have opportunity to accept other ways of life. If you're afraid, if you don't have enough internal strength, you will hold to one narrative. The stronger you are, the more you believe that your way of life could not be challenge of others, but you can accept it. You can accept it as other possible interpretation. So tolerance doesn't mean absence of power. Tolerance means more power than people who are angry or people who aggressive.
Yeah, but I'll take 2 minutes probably. I want to tell a story that I went through, which I think is relevant to your conflict there. So I was in some training, and it was a role play, and I was assigned a role of some Cambodian Khmer Rouge former commander. And so I was assigned this role and now I'm some kind of high official. I'm preventing anything from history of this period being written, of 75 genocide in Cambodia being written into the textbooks. And I have to meet somebody who is a history teacher whose family has been massacred and who doesn't want any revenge but want to write simply the story into the textbooks. And I refused the role, said I can't do it. It's a person who did the genocide. I'm not going to go argue for this. I'm just going to go tell them just kill me or I'm going to do suicide. And the trainer said, do what you want to do. So I went there, and my counterpart started attacking me, saying, you are this genocidal, this horrible person, and this. And then I'm trying to read my role, saying, but you don't understand. It was a time of, I don't know, imperialist powers attacking us. There was no other way but to go about this. And 5-10 minutes into it, I was very, very passionately arguing for a case of genocide, saying, okay, I'm not saying genocide is a good thing, but there are situations when you have no choice, and we had no choice. So I was truly believing it for like 5 minutes of play. So that coming out of it, like, and really realizing what happened to me, I said, okay, basically 5 minutes being pressured by somebody, I started arguing for genocide. So, I mean, it doesn't excuse somebody who does it, but it kind of gave me a perspective that even that perspective at some point should be understood to understand how it's even possible to happen. It doesn't, again, not to excuse it, not to punish that's happening, but to really understand that understanding how that can happen is really important for preventing it in the future.
Short story. There is a narrative conflict resolution. So you give narrative, I will give you another narrative, very short one. 2 monks were walking to their monastery, and while they were walking there, they saw a river, and it was a woman there. And woman could not cross the river because it was pretty fast water, and one monk took on his hands and just walked around along the river. And then another one became angry and told, how you can, we could not touch women, why can you do it? And they were going for 2 days, and finally they were very close to their place, and the first one told, you know, I left this woman near the river. You were bringing her for 2 days. So this is about how to give up.
Recently I read the news about there was a law in the European Union which was about Cyprus registered the Turkish delight as a Cyprus as a specialty for Cyprus named Cyprus lokomi, which is in fact it is a Turkish it's a Turkish sweet, yeah. And this is an example how you are forcing by law a special kind of yeah, it's a part of the Turkish identity, maybe part of their kitchen. Is it right to force the story to dictate it by law, or is it another example? For example, recently in Syria, for example, the Syrian people are rejected the type of the identity which was forced on them for decades. For example, the type of identity, the type of history which was dictated by the elite. For example, let's call it the elite. Don't you think that there will come and there will be a stage in which the society will not accept that type of dictation, that identity, that history?
Thank you. I'm going to ask for a few comments,
Yes,
questions
sure.
together so we can move along.
Thank you. I was thinking about the scenario between Turkey and Greece, and I'm sorry to bring up Turkey again. But I feel like from our perspective, especially as Armenians, we can identify with their circumstances. And I feel like they have opposing narratives, but at the same time, they have a modus vivendi. They're getting along. Maybe they've had some political resolution, but I get the impression that they have a zero-sum set of narratives that are not interfering with their lives. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure.
95 թվականին գրականության մեթոդիկայի մեջ մեզ հրահանգվում էր, որ մենք Աստվածաշնչի տեսանկյունով պետք է ուսուցանենք պրոբլեմային խնդիրները, եւ դա շատ արդյունավետ էր փորձառությունից գիտենք դա։ Եվ հարցը ուղղում եմ նաև ձեզ, ասում եք պատմության մասնագետները պետք է լինեն իսկական մասնագետ։ Չեք գտնում, եթե պատմության մասնագետները բացարձակ պատմության դասագիրքը, որը Բիբլիան է, Աստվածաշունչն է, դրանից չեն օգտվում, մենք արդեն նոյի ժողովուրդ էլ կարող ենք սակարկվել եւ ուզենան մեզ կհանեն սխալ եւ կդառնան ներողություն կույրերի կարծիքը Թումանյանի, որ բոլորս վերլուծում ենք փիղը պարզ լույսի տակ է։
Ինչպես նշեցիք, պատմությունը ժամանակի ամենամեծ ուսուցիչն է։ Ես ուզում եմ վերադառնամ մեր ներկա ժամանակի պատմությանը։ Ձեր կարծիքով ապագայում ինչ կկերտի ներկա պատմությունը հայ ժողովրդի համար։ Շնորհակալություն։
Աշոտ Մերձյան, պատմաբան, ես ինչքան հասկացա, դուք ավելի կողմնակից եք, որ պատմությունը գրվի ինչ-որ, ես ուտենց եթե ճիշտ եմ ընկալել, որ պատվերով գրվի նոր պատմություն, անդուրժողականություն, բայց դուք չեք գտնում, որ դա կերտել է պատմությունը, դա պատմություն չարի կա։ Պատմությունը պետք է ներկայացնել ճիշտ փաստերով, եւ դա է ամենաճիշտ անդուրժողականության ապագան, երաշխիքները։
You each get a couple of minutes and please respond as you wish to any of them, and that will be your concluding.
Let's start with, while I think an example, you asked about Turkey and Greece, and recently what a huge scandal in Greece, it was a competition, one textbook won, and the group of scholars wrote textbook. And they did not tell that Turks are good, but at least they told that they were not as bad as they were before. And they did not deny that Orthodox Church was the leader of revolution, but they at least tell that it was not real leader, it was actually was not very active in revolution. And textbooks was it was a complete scandal in the society. People were put in textbook on the fire. I'm not joking. Really, the woman who was the leader of Maria Ripausi, she was targeted. They were even throwing eggs and tomatoes into her. She had to escape for a few months because it was a huge outcry in society how she can portray Turks in this way. They're awful, they always were awful, and they will never change. And that's why societies are not sometimes ready for such change. But what is important to tell, and answering maybe a little ask questions, when we are not rewriting history, we are not inventing tolerant history. There are so many events in histories where people have common collaborative experiences. They have happy history of coexistence. And this should be really emphasized. It should be emphasized that it's not only conflict, it's not only something which produces the history. And answering your issue, what should be done about common right now, what history is now about. It should be not only told about threat and fights fights on the border and denial of such particular refusal of to go to summit, NATO summit in Chicago, which coming right now. What should also in this history should be examples of some exhibitions, some writers, or somebody who developed more tolerant community, more tolerant society. And more such example prototypes building society, the more we will go into the acceptance of peace.
Thank you. Phil and then Valhammer.
Sure. I want to take the last question because I think it's a really important question. I think there is a misconception when we talk about peace that we are offering to write some kind of a tolerant story. I'm absolutely not what I'm saying at all from my end, and I'm not even advocating for a common history, at least not at this point. And I'm not against, of course, history should be like, we should write about facts as much as evidence we can bring. But what's happening, there are innumerable, I don't know, millions of events that happened in history. So we cannot put them all in a textbook. So what we're going to put in a textbook, or actually even history book, or books, is going to be some kind of a selection, some particular events that we pick for whatever reason we pick, and the interpretation of them, the way we choose to interpret them. So that is a very conscious process done by the historians in a very particular way. So the way we do that is what I see sometimes problematic. Because that you can pick the events that are necessarily only those that are portraying the other side in a negative light and leave out everything that is potentially negative about yourself, pretty much then creating a story through a specific selection of very true events. So you don't really fake anything, but you end up just still creating a story through your selection. So this is potentially problematic if you really use it in a way to create negative feelings toward the other side, which is happening, I believe, both in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in Turkey, and so on right now. Yeah.
So first I'll take the next question, and then yours. Look, it's really interesting what's going on in the Turkish historiography concerning the genocide. And I want to touch upon the genocide question. The genocide discourse in Turkey, it has directions. One, of course, the denial direction, which is prevalent still, but the other one, which has humors. Is the one which tried to see the Armenian genocide as a part of Turkish history as well, which is something interesting. From Armenian side, there have been some historical research trying to contextualize the genocide within the Turkish history, Turkish context, which doesn't mean that it's just a shared responsibility for genocide, just the opposite, saying that the genocide perpetrated by Turks should be seen by Turkish history as well, not to avoid that part of history, not to neglect that part of history, just to take it as it was. So this creation of common history, some common history, common narrative for genocide, I guess can move this discourse further. Concerning the question of Bible. Well, our country is a secular country, and I can't imagine that the Bible should be in the center of teaching. But Bible, of course, everybody knows that Bible is an important source for historiography. It's a primary source, and multiple volumes of books have been written based on Bible. But some portions of Bible, of course, can be incorporated into the moral upbringing of the students, of the pupils in the schools. But in general, for instance, you cannot rely on Bible, try to interpret or explain the events in the 20th century, 19th century. So the Bible has limitations, obviously. But I see a point that some tolerance from Bible can also be incorporated when there is an effort to write a common narrative, common history. And Troy, your question, I guess.
Thank you to Karina Korostelina, to Phil Ramakrelian, and to Vahan Matevosyan, and thank you to you. I want to take 1 second to pat ourselves on the back, Civilitas, only because we didn't know that this topic, as academic as we thought it was going to be so relevant to what we're doing today. And that is that at the end of the day, what you learn and teach about history is going to affect how we see ourselves at every level of our lives, including our domestic life, our values, our relationships with each other internally, let alone externally. So thank you. And come back in a couple of weeks when I think our guest is going to be Murat Belge, who is a professor of history in Istanbul at Bilgi University. And we're going to talk, in fact, about new perceptions in Turkey. So in a way, it's a continuation of this. Thank you.